Kallum Pickering is a senior economist with Berenberg, a multinational investment and private banking company, and I asked him about the likelihood of Britain leaving the EU and the public's take on the issue.
At the moment, the opinion polls suggest that a majority of the UK would vote to remain in the EU should a referendum take place tomorrow. Now, that proportion has fallen somewhat since the middle of last year, when there was a greater proportion of support for EU membership, and there's a very good reason for that. This vote will not take place based upon specific issues that we might have seen in the deal today. What we will see is people vote on key issues. And when I mean key issues, I'm talking about things like migration. The EU migrant crisis, which came to the fore last August, is the key reason why support for the EU has fallen back in the UK. Now, when people in the UK see migrants across Europe, especially in places like Germany, it's a country which people perceive to be similar to the UK. When we see the terrible events in Cologne and Paris, that works up public opinion against the EU, and that could set big enough momentum for people to vote out. So that reduction in support has taken place with the migrant crisis. But still, on the whole, people are still for the EU, but it's getting much closer than it was.
What do you say to the argument that the EU is a drag on the UK economy, especially if it does stay in the bloc?
Well, as an economist, I just don't see evidence to support that view. What I would say is there's certainly scope to reduce the regulatory burden within the EU. There's no doubt that that poses a drag on businesses that operate across the whole of the EU. But the argument is not whether or not there are certain elements of the EU which drag on economic growth. The argument is whether or not the UK would be more prosperous in or outside of the EU. Now, it seems clear to me that the UK would be stronger within the EU. Partly what Cameron's deal has done, it set targets to reduce that regulatory burden. So I actually think if those individual promises which formed the deal that Cameron negotiated last weekend are followed up with, we would see a reduction, a material reduction in the regulatory burden, and across the EU businesses would prosper.
On the other hand, do you think the EU could survive financially without the UK?
What we would see if the UK were to Brexit, say, is the single biggest threat to the cohesion of Europe since its inception. We'd most likely see populist parties around Europe push for their own in-out referendums. Now, I think France will be particularly vulnerable, especially with Le Pen, who is now making significant progress, but not just in France. There are other populist parties across Europe that would push for their own referendums. So what we may see is something similar to what happened in 2010, 2011 during the sovereign debt crisis, where financial markets begin to price in which countries they think could leave the EU first, and the act of yields for those governments rising could jar financial markets and the economy.
We're still quite a ways away from June 23rd. A lot can happen between now and then. What do you think will happen? How do you think the British people will vote?
I think the British public will vote to remain in the EU. I think it will be much closer than people expected. That's partly because of the migration issue in Europe that has really had a big impact on the polls. But what I'd say is most of the time the UK are fairly pragmatic voters, and when it comes to issues with big economic implications, they tend to vote with their wallets. And for most people, including some very reluctant Conservative MPs who have come out in the last few days and said, actually, on balance, the UK is stronger both economically and politically in the European Union, we expect most voters to think this way too and vote to remain in the EU.